As we're reporting today, if the Australian government was aware of concerns for Mr Jenkins' welfare last month, why do you think it's taken so long for this to be made public?
Look, I think the Prime Minister made clear in his statement yesterday that Australia, quite rightly, I think, expresses some scepticism in terms of social media or other material that's emanating from Russia at the moment, and that can be used for propaganda purposes in the course of the war. We also need to be mindful that Australia doesn't have full diplomatic representation in Ukraine at the moment. And likewise, Australia's diplomatic presence in Russia is a little limited. So the capacity of Australia to really get to the bottom of this report inevitably has been a little compromised under these circumstances. And of course, we have an armed conflict, a significant war taking place.
How could he be brought home? What are the avenues available to the government here?
Look, at the moment, they're quite limited, and I think we really need to be cautious about thinking about the ways in which Mr. Jenkins could be brought home. The critical issue at the moment, and this was really alluded to by the statement issued by Mark Dreyfus, the acting foreign minister yesterday, is, of course, that Russia adhered to international humanitarian law, and in particular, that Mr. Jenkins is recognised as a prisoner of war. And so that's really the issue I think that Australia will really be concerned about, and that is the characterisation of Mr. Jenkins as a prisoner of war, for which he would gain certain entitlements and privileges under the Geneva Conventions, or whether Russia would seek to label Mr. Jenkins as a mercenary, which could have much more disastrous consequences for his future.
Could you take us through what some of those potential consequences may be? What sort of obligations does Russia have under international law in relation to the treatment of Mr. Jenkins?
Well, if Mr. Jenkins is treated as a prisoner of war, the 1949 Geneva Convention very clearly outlines the protections and the privileges that a prisoner of war should be entitled to. And indeed, both sides in this conflict in Ukraine have taken prisoners and sought to generally uphold the Geneva Convention. And indeed, consistent with the Geneva Convention, there's been exchanges of prisoners from both the Russian and the Ukrainian side that has been taking place throughout 2024. If, on the other hand, Mr. Jenkins is labelled as a mercenary because he's considered to be a foreign fighter who's being paid for his services and has been engaged in active combat in Ukraine, well, he may well be charged under Russian law, prosecuted, and most likely convicted, given the success of the conviction rates in Russia. And that's a practice that we've seen Russia engage in with respect to a number of the foreign fighters who've been captured throughout this conflict.
How likely do you think it is that prisoner swap discussions are underway? What sort of conversations do you think the Australian government could be having?
I really think that's too premature at the moment. I think, as Mr. Dreyfus indicated yesterday in his statement, Australia is really seeking to ascertain the status of Mr. Jenkins to confirm his well-being. Once all of that has been determined, and of course we also know that there were exchanges yesterday between the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Russian ambassador here in Canberra, but once all of those key issues have been determined, Australia will be on much firmer ground in terms of how to communicate and engage with the Russians at a legal level once Mr. Jenkins' status has been conclusively resolved. And as I said, I think the best outcome for him is that if he's classified as a prisoner of war, he will automatically be entitled to a range of protections, as is the case with Ukrainians who've been captured by Russia during this conflict.